Hello students, I would like to talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue is one of our four primary tissue categories. It's the most diverse, abundant, and widely distributed of all tissues in the body. It supports, protects, and binds all the organs. It contains protein fibers, cells, and ground substance. Some examples of connective tissue would be tendons, ligaments, adipose tissue, cartilage, bone, and blood. Now, all connective tissue shares three basic components: cells, protein, and ground substance. Cells vary depending on the type of connective tissue, as do the protein fibers and the ground substance. If you've ever been to the restaurant, the Spaghetti Factory, you'll know that you're given a menu and you're able to sit down and pick out the type of pasta you want, the kind of sauce you want, and the kind of meat you want. So you could have linguine with white clam sauce, or you could have a spaghetti bolognese with Italian sausages. Connective tissue is basically the same. All the fibers would be different kinds of spaghetti noodles. All of the cells are going to be the little chunks of meat, and then the sauces are ground substance. So depending on what you're feeling like a certain day, you could go in and order basically any kind of pasta combination you wanted. The same is true with connective tissue. It depends on what function we need the connective tissue to perform, and that is going to determine the structure of our connective tissue, which cells we're going to have in it, and which protein fibers. So here's our general example of connective tissue. We have some cells that are residential, they just kind of stay put. We've got cells that are fibroblasts that create fibers, and then there's a lot of adipocytes that are just fat cells. Some cells are mesenchymal cells. These are a type of embryonic stem cell, and they'll divide rapidly to replace damaged cells. There are fixed macrophages, which are a type of white blood cell. It's pretty big. It's pretty big. They tend to stay in the tissues and help defend us against infection. Some of the cells will wander through connective tissue. Parts of the immune system have cells that will wander through connective tissue. Some of the cells will repair damaged extracellular matrix. And there's a lot of leukocytes. Leukocytes are a type of white blood cell that again provides protection against infection. Other types of wandering cells might be mast cells, which are small mobile cells that contain chemicals important in inflammation, and plasma cells, which are super important in the immune system because they produce antibodies. There are free macrophages, which wander around eating different bits of bacteria or infected cells, and other types of leukocytes. When we look at protein fibers, there's three different protein fibers. There's collagen, which is a cable-like bundle of protein fibers. Imagine if you took three ropes and kind of wove them together. That's what collagen is like. It's incredibly strong. Reticular fibers are a lot smaller in diameter to the collagen fibers, and they tend to branch a lot too. They're very tough, but they're flexible. And we find these abundant in the stroma, or the connective tissue framework, of things like lymph nodes and the spleen and the liver. Elastic fibers are the last type of connective tissue protein fiber. Just like the name would imply, they are stretchy. They contain a protein called elastin, and they'll stretch and then recoil back to the resting length fairly easily. We find these in places like the skin and the arteries and the lungs. Finally, the ground substance is the material that's produced by connective tissue cells that holds all of the cells and all of the protein fibers. The ground substance varies quite widely between different types of connective tissue. In blood, which is a type of connective tissue, the ground substance is mostly water. In bone, which is also a type of connective tissue, the ground substance is fairly solid. Ground substance plus the protein fibers are what we call the extracellular matrix. Now, the cells that we find in connective tissue are living, but the extracellular matrix, meaning the ground substance and the protein fibers, are non-living. The cells are the caretakers of the ground substance and the fibers, which give our connective tissue its resiliency and strength. Other things we find inside of the ground substance are going to be glycosaminoglycans, also known as GAGs. They're large molecules that help hold on to water. These are large molecules that help us to hold on to water. You might know some of them as chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate, and hyaluronic acid. There's also proteoglycans that form with the GAGs and other glycoprotein molecules. Now, we have this huge variety of structure and therefore a huge variety of function of connective tissue. Connective tissue does several things. Some types of connective tissue can provide physical protection. The bones of the skull, the bones of the thoracic cage will protect our internal organs. The bones of the skull and the spinal column will protect the brain and spinal cord. The bones of the thoracic cage will protect the heart and the lungs. Connective tissue also is used as a bony framework, a place for muscular attachment. There's a type of cartilage that keeps your trachea open as you breathe so it doesn't collapse. We also have connective tissue to help support other organs such as the kidney and the spleen. Connective tissue will also attach things such as ligaments to bone or tendons to muscle. Connective tissue can be used as a storage medium. Adipose connective tissue is our major energy reserve. And bone actually has a lot of storage capacity in it too. We use connective tissue for transport, such as blood carrying nutrients and gases and waste products. And the white blood cells, again part of connective tissue, are there for immune protection. So when we look at connective tissue, all of it is going to be derived from embryonic mesenchyme. And mesenchyme, as it differentiates into adult connective tissue, becomes either connective tissue proper, supporting connective tissue, or fluid connective tissue. So let's look at connective tissue proper for a minute. So loose connective tissue is our first type of proper connective tissue. It has fewer cells and protein fibers than the dense variety. The protein fibers are kind of spread out. They're fairly irregularly arranged. There's a lot of ground substance. And you can kind of think of it as kind of the body's packing material. We don't have organs and things bouncing around loose in our body. Everything's packed in fairly well. Our first specific type of loose connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. Areolar connective tissue is a loose organization of collagen and elastic fibers. It is highly vascular. Remember, epithelial tissue was avascular. Connective tissue varies depending on the type of connective tissue on how vascular it is. It turns out that areolar connective tissue is highly vascular. There's a lot of ground substance. It's pretty viscous, very fluid. And we find things like areolar connective tissue in any areas of the body that need just a little bit of separation from each other. For example, we'll have thin membranes of areolar connective tissue on the papillary layer of the skin. We find it in the subcutaneous layer of our fat and surrounding organs and nerves and muscle cells. Our second type of connective tissue is adipose tissue, or fat. It's made up of a cell. It's made of a cell called adipocytes. And there's two types. There's white adipocytes and brown adipocytes. White stores energy. Brown is typically found in newborns and generates a lot of heat. And as we get older, we lose it and it becomes the white. The adipocyte number remains fairly stable, but the size of the cells will change. So no hyperplasia, but we do have hypertrophy. So we don't get more cells, but they do get bigger. And finally, our last type of loose connective tissue is reticular connective tissue. It's kind of a dense mesh of reticular fibers. Remember, these were similar to collagen fibers, but they were smaller and more branched. We have a lot of fibroblasts, which are the little cells that make fibers, a lot of leukocytes or white blood cells inside of reticular connective tissue. And we have reticular connective tissue kind of spread throughout the entire body, but we do have large concentrations of it in things like the spleen, the thymus, lymph nodes, and bone marrow, all very important places for white blood cells. Moving on to dense connective tissue. We have dense regular connective tissue, which is tightly packed, and we have all of these parallel collagen fibers. Now, I know they're wavy, but they're all wavy in the same direction. And so you can see this tissue here is almost entirely made out of collagen fibers. It's insanely strong when it's pulled out in this direction. Dense irregular connective tissue also has lots and lots of collagen fibers, but they are more unevenly distributed, but they are more irregularly distributed throughout the tissue. And so we don't get quite the insane amounts of strength in one direction, but we do get very good amounts of strength in any direction. And then elastic connective tissue is found only in a couple places of the body, primarily in the very large arteries of the body, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. The elastic connective tissue has an abundance of elastic fibers, and it's extremely stretchy. Some examples of dense regular connective tissue would be tendons. Some examples of dense irregular connective tissue would be the dermis of the skin, the periosteum of bone, joint capsules, and then the elastic connective tissue, as I mentioned, is mostly in the elastic arteries, a little bit in the trachea and in the vocal cords. We have supporting connective tissue. Now this is a little bit separate from our connective tissue proper. We have cartilage and we have bone. There are three kinds of cartilage. Cartilage is a firm, kind of semi-solid, cartilage has a firm, semi-solid extracellular matrix. The ground substance is fairly dense. Chondrocytes are the type of cell that we have within cartilage. The ground substance is so dense in cartilage that the chondrocytes cannot exist just living free inside of the extracellular matrix. And so what they end up doing is they make a little lagoon or little room for themselves. Those little lagoons are called lacuna. So anytime you see little lagoons like this, little lakes, that's a sign that you're looking at some kind of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage. It has kind of this clear glassy appearance under a microscope. You do have collagen fibers in there. They're just very, very difficult to see. We have hyaline cartilage in the nose, the trachea, the larynx, the costal cartilages of the ribs, the articular ends of long bones, and most of the fetal skeleton is actually made out of hyaline cartilage. It resembles a white, kind of dense, plasticky material. Fibrocartilage is weight-bearing. It's very good at resisting compression. And as you look at it here in the microscope slide, There's lots and lots and lots of fibers. We also have cells within lacunae, so you know you're in cartilage. Again, with all of the fibers, that's fibrocartilage. We find fibrocartilage in the intervertebral discs of the back, the pubic symphysis, and the meniscus of the knee. And finally, elastic cartilage is flexible, it's very springy, it has a lot of elastic fibers in it, and cells within lacunae. We find this in two areas only. This is found in the cartilage of the ear and in the epiglottis of the throat. The elastic cartilage, because it springs back to its original shape, elastic cartilage has this really neat function. It will spring back to its original shape once it's been deformed a little bit. So you can take your finger, you can bend your ear down, and as soon as you let go, it pops back to its original position. The epiglottis is the same way. It is normally open so that we can breathe, and then as we swallow, muscles will pull it, fold it over, just like your ear folds over, and then as soon as those muscles relax, it pops back open again. This allows us to continue to breathe even when our muscles are relaxed. Finally, our last supporting connective tissue is bone. Now, there are two types of bone. There is compact bone, which you can see here, and there is spongy bone. Bone is much more solid than cartilage. It offers greater support, but it has less flexibility. Bone has organic components. There's collagen and lots of glycoproteins, and some inorganic components like calcium salts. The cells that live inside of bones are called osteocytes. Most of our bones come from a cartilaginous source. And because we always had lacuna in cartilage, we also have lacuna in bone. As you can see here, compact bone is perforated by little tunnels. These are neurovascular canals. Each of these little round structures is called an osteon, or a Haversian system. Spongy bone is located in the interior of bones, and it's a lattice work of bone. It's very strong, but very lightweight. And resembles coral. Now, bone does several things for us. It supports tissues, it protects organs, but it also stores minerals. As far as physiology is concerned, the most important things the bones do is store and release calcium. Bones also produce all of our red and our white blood cells. Finally, our last type of connective tissue is blood. It's our fluid connective tissue along with lymphatic fluid. Blood contains cells, of course. There are fibers in blood. They are dissolved most of the time, unless you're trying to clot. And the ground substance is called plasma. It is mostly water, but there are some other molecules in there, things like salt ions, glucose, and dissolved gases. Lymph comes from blood plasma. It has no cellular components or fragments, and ultimately it gets returned to the bloodstream. Moving on to muscle, there are three types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is really interesting. Skeletal muscle cells are as long as the entire muscle. So that's crazy long. You've got some cells in your body that are literally like a foot long. Because these cells are so long, you cannot have one nucleus in the very center trying to dictate what's going on. And so as a result, skeletal muscle cells have multiple peripheral nuclei scattered throughout the cell. Skeletal muscle also has stripes or striations that you can see here on the microscope slide. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. You can move it when you choose to, and it moves the skeleton, hence skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is similar to skeletal muscle in that it has striations, but they tend to be uninucleate, meaning there's only one nucleus per cell, and the cells are very short. The cells are also branched. Now, unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is involuntary. That means that you do not consciously control it. Instead, you unconsciously control it. And that's actually a really good thing. You don't want to have to sit and think at your heart to make it beat every time it needs to move blood. Your biceps, on the other hand, when you want your biceps to contract, you think at your biceps muscle and it contracts. That would get really old with the cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle, also known as visceral, is involuntary, just like cardiac muscle. The cells are microscopic. They're kind of spindle-shaped, almost like a little deflated football. We find these in the walls of most of our internal organs and in hollow tubes in the body, like the intestine and in the airways and in our blood vessels. These smooth muscles are much slower to contract than cardiac and skeletal muscle. And these smooth muscles are much slower to contract and relax than our cardiac and skeletal muscles are. Finally, our last type of tissue in the body. Our fourth category of generalized tissue is going to be nervous tissue. There's two types of nervous tissue. There are neurons, which are the rock stars of the nervous tissue. These are very large cells that receive, process, and send signals in the body. Supporting all of these neurons are what we call glial cells. There's a whole little variety of them, and they help support the rock stars in their rock star lifestyle. Oh my gosh. Here's a picture of a neuron. You can see the large portion of the body here is called you can see a neuron. The large portion of the cell body is called the soma. The area near the nucleus is called the perikaryon, and these little short branched areas are called dendrites. This very long process here is called the axon. The axon can be several feet long. So yes, that's a single cell, single neuron, that can be several feet long. I want to talk about body membranes for a few minutes. Let's talk about body membranes for a few minutes. There's four kinds of membranes in the body: mucosal membranes, serous, cutaneous, and synovial membranes. And they each have a job to do, and each job has a specific structure to go along with that particular function. Oh my gosh. Mucous membranes line compartments that open into the external environment. So the inside of your lungs and your nasal passageway, the inside of your digestive system, and parts of the reproductive tracts are all lined with mucous membranes. It's pretty easy to remember. You generate a lot of mucus in your respiratory tract. It's a mucous membrane. The mucosa performs protective, absorptive, and secretory functions in the body. Serous membranes line body cavities that do not normally open into the outside environment. Serous membranes are typically simple squamous epithelial cells. They produce a thin, watery secretion called serous fluid, and that helps to reduce friction between the different membranes. Now, each serous membrane comes in a pair. The outermost of the pairs is called the parietal layer. The innermost of the pair is called the visceral layer. For example, The heart has a serous membrane surrounding it. On the very, very outside of the heart, we have the visceral pericardium. There's a little space, and then our parietal pericardium. In between the visceral and the parietal is just a tiny bit of serous fluid, so that as the heart beats and the visceral and the parietal layers are moving past each other, it decreases friction and prevents rubbing. You also have a serous membrane pair around the lungs called the pleura. So you have a visceral pleura and a parietal pleura with the space in between called the parietal space. And you also have a last serous membrane pair in the abdominal pelvic cavity called the peritoneum. The cutaneous membrane is your skin. It covers your external body surface, and it has both keratinized stratified squamous epithelium and underlying connective tissue. The cutaneous membrane protects the internal organs and prevents loss by water. Finally, synovial membranes line most of the joints in the body, not all of them, but most of them. It's made out of areolar connective tissue and covered by squamous epithelial cells and doesn't really have a basement membrane. There is synovial fluid secreted by the epithelial cells, which helps decrease friction and allows the joints to move much more easily. Now, as we look at some words that define tissue modifications, these are really important to understand. Hyper, of course, means more than usual, and trophy is size. So hypertrophy is a bigger size than normal. A single cell can hypertrophy and become a much bigger cell. Hyperplasia, on the other hand, means an increase in the number of cells. Atrophy is when we get a shrinkage of a single cell. Atrophy is when we get shrinkage of cells. Just the size, not the number. Oh my gosh. Atrophy is where we get a shrinkage in the size of cells instead of a decrease in the cell number. Aplasia would be the proper term for a decrease in cell, no, that's not really, yeah. Atrophy indicates a shrinkage in tissue by decrease in cell size or number. Meta means beyond, so metaplasia is a change of the epithelial cells to a different form. For example, this often happens under stress, so smokers can experience metaplastic changes in the trachea or the lungs. The cells that are affected will start to change, but if you catch it in this stage, this metaplastic stage, and stop the stress, the cells can quickly go back to normal. Dysplasia is abnormal tissue development. This is precancerous. It can revert back to normal, or it could go into full cancer, but dysplasia needs to be monitored closely. And then finally, neoplasia is new growth, tissue growth that is out of control. We define neoplasia by benign and malignant. Benign is localized, usually has an enclosed capsule, and it doesn't spread very fast, doesn't grow very fast. Malignant, on the other hand, benign neoplasias are a localized growth. They're typically encapsulated. They don't spread. They grow very slowly. Malignant neoplasia, on the other hand, metastasizes or it spreads to different areas of the body. And this is full-on cancer. Typically, malignant neoplasia will spread quickly. It typically is not encapsulated, so it really has no boundaries. Malignant neoplasias typically spread fast and don't really have malignant neoplasia, in addition to metastasizing or spreading, typically grow very quickly and are unbounded by any kind of surrounding encapsulation. Necrosis is our last tissue modification. It's cell death. This is due to irreversible tissue damage or an inflammatory response to tissue damage. For example, gangrene will cause necrosis of the tissues. Different types of tissues die differently. They will necrose differently in the body. So let's look at a pathology here called scurvy. Collagen, if you remember, is an important protein molecule. It was one of the fibers of connective tissue. It's very important for strength, and it supports nearly all of your body tissues. Vitamin C is essential for healthy collagen formation, and scurvy is a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. So symptoms would be weakness, gum ulcerations, hemorrhaging, and abnormal bone growth, all because you're not making collagen fibers properly. Finally, another connective tissue disease is called Marfan syndrome. It's a rare genetic disease of connective tissue and abnormal. Symptoms are abnormally long fingers and toes, malformation of the thoracic cage and the vertebral column. The joints tend to be very weak, and so they're easily dislocated. Weakness in the aorta and of the abnormal heart valves. So a lot of times these patients will die from a dissecting abdominal aneurysm. It's thought that possibly Abraham Lincoln had Marfan syndrome.